a learning tool for you as well is what does equity mean to you, right? So today we are looking at this as a perspective of not just racial equity, but also trying to bring the conversation in from a lens of youth, from people living with disabilities, people who are sometimes we have now with seniors, looking at it at a broader equity. So I just wanted to know, and maybe in the chat, and this is a little bit challenging because we can't see the chat, how people define equity, and what pockets of communities are you looking to engage in your community. And then the other piece that we wanted to hear from a few people, if you wanted to share before we get into the conversation at you, but rather with you, is why do you value having this conversation of equity? We know you're here. You obviously already are on side, but what is it for you specifically, or for your organization, or for your community, why you feel that this conversation is important? So feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to share. Katrina, I see that you're unmuted. Did you want to, or was that just by accident? And right. Peter, is there anything in the Paige or Peter in the chat you want to share before I?
Yeah, so I see a few things in the chat. I'll just scroll back here. Johanna Clark, I don't know if you wanted to, you had a comment about, are you going to talk about ... So just to give you, so I'll just say that out loud for you, Johanna. It says, are you going to talk about gender at all? Board member currently struggling as a woman with bullying by several men in the board at meetings and letters sent to me. And then beyond that, getting some feedback about whether people are board members and not, and there's quite a few who are, yeah. Or they're going to be involved with a process that involves their board.
So thank you for that, Peter. So first of all, to the individual who asked about gender, I'm sorry that's happening. And you know what, I hope we can address some of that. And if not, please let us know through questions and through comments if you want some more specifics on that, because it is hard to address everything in this, but hopefully some of this will be helpful. So what I wanted to do, I guess, is first share that why do we want to do this? So Revenue Canada has a charity secretariat, and they've done a survey, which now closed, on what to start to take some stats on how equity groups are represented on not-for-profit boards. The survey's closed. Like I said, closed on January 19th, and the survey results should be out. They say spring 2021, so hopefully in a couple of months. But one of the things that we do know is that the boards do not represent our communities, right? There's a huge difference. And why does that matter? Well, it depends, obviously, in your instance with farmers markets. There's a huge discrepancy from who is in this industry versus who is the face of this industry, is what we are recognizing. But that's not unique, right, to farmers markets. That's generally how it is in health sector. That's generally how it is in the arts. And how do we start to change that is, I think, first of all, is having conversations like this. The other thing that we are hoping that we can do today is share how those conversations happen and allowing those conversations to happen, because I know one of the things I have witnessed in my own life, and one of the things that I have witnessed in my work and organizations, is there tends to be this kind of, let's back away from anybody that's causing these uncomfortable conversations or causing discomfort or asking these questions about that make people feel uncomfortable. And what we're hoping to do is build allies so that we can ask those uncomfortable questions. And that's, I think, the number one piece for me is creating a place of comfort, whether it's on your board or whether it's with your staff or whether it's with your community or your family, is to be able to ask those uncomfortable questions. So why did we do something this way? Why did we never have things translated into different languages? Why are we using our pronouns now? Why does that matter? And those are all really valuable questions. Yes, they take time, but they're very valuable questions. For instance, pronouns, right? I changed mine for every meeting. And I think that's just an important piece of acknowledgement of how equity can be represented even without a conversation, just by actually changing your pronouns on your Zoom page. Paige, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll move on to the next screen. If that's,
sure.
Yeah. Okay, so what we wanted to touch on obviously is like, what is governance? This is the same slide and the same definition that I had up in 2018, but in 2018, the focus, as I say, was really on like, what is governance and how does that relate to management? But if you look at this now with the lens of equity and look like the definition, of looking at who has power and who makes decisions and how our voice is heard. Like when you look at that with an equity lens, it's so clear that governance has a lot to say, a lot to contribute towards equity on your board. And that's why we want to be able to pay attention to that today. I think that Ruby, maybe you wanted to speak to this a little bit, but it was about obviously equity in 2018, the idea, like the sort of the idea of equity was at a different stage, I guess, a different phase of development in terms of how people were viewing equity, and compared to today. Since 2018, we've had like Black Lives Matters happened. Obviously, there's been a lot of Idle No More, like all sorts of a lot of even conversations around gender, like all of that has really evolved even in the last 3 years. Like there's been so much movement on a lot of this. And so, and of course, most recently, and as is happening currently, COVID is really laying bare a lot of how we're viewing equity in the workplace. And so this idea of governance and equity have obviously a lot to do with each other. And that's why we thought it was important to bring the conversations together for this presentation. Do you want to say anything for this slide?
No, I think I'll save it for the next slide, which is probably helps the framework of the conversation. So if we were in real life, I would ask you to show your hands and see who's heard of these before, but this is a little bit different world that we're in right now. So this is, so don't be alarmed. We are going to talk about governance models and, like the phase of a board and some specifics on, what a hands-off board can do and what a more hands-on board and just kind of the difference. But one of the reasons I wanted to put this slide in here is it's first of all, it's the 4 agreements. It's a book, and there's a whole workshop and everything that you can do with it. I'm not selling it. That's not why I'm here. It's a John Miguel Rios. He's Mexican. He's a thought leader from Mexico, and he wrote this book. And so I have really kind of referenced this not just in the past, but especially during COVID. And that's why I wanted to put this here, because I think in this time where we are hopefully as a community looking at, that phrase, we're all in this together. And I'm sure all of you have heard, we're not in this together, or we're in this, we're all in the same storm, but with different boats, I think it is, or, with those various phrases. What I'm really hoping that we can do today is look at these 4 agreements really as guidelines when we start to look at how strategic plans are developed, how communication happens, how the hierarchy in boards develops, and how we address each other. And are we on boards for our own personal growth, or are we on, for our own personal growth, or for personal agendas, or are we on there to really make the organization stronger? And so I'll reference them as we go along. I mean, they're not they're very subjective. So it'll be a look on how I feel that this helps. And so I wanted to just bring that that screen up, and we might, like I said, bring it up a few times through the conversation. But I do feel like in terms of equity lens on how we look at boards, it really is a check-in with yourself first, right? We all have our biases. There's a million, there's a million books out there that we can read on how to do better. But I think we need some opportunity to really look at ourselves, because we can't bring in other people into a fold that doesn't necessarily represent how you believe and how you feel. And I guess the other piece, and I'll move on for a bit, is what I'm really hoping why this framework to apply it is we don't want to have equity be something that you just do off the side of your desk. Oh yes, we forgot to put equity on the agenda. I'll share in one of my organizations that I'm on the board on, and I'm not going to name which one. There was when Black Lives Matter became really public at the peak, and a lot of organizations were coming out with equity statements. One of the organizations that I am on the board on, they wanted to have an equity statement. And for me, that was really concerning, because it's the process that matters, right? It's are we all going to agree to this equity statement? And if we're not going to agree to this equity statement and go through the process of it, does it really matter, right? What are we doing here? So that's one thing. Like I said, there's a lot of rules and regs that we have to follow with our BC Societies Act, but I'm hoping we can refer to these 4 agreements as we go through it. Thank you, Paige.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So looking at your board, there are sort of spheres of influence that that are involved. So if you look at some of the external spheres that you need to pay attention to, those that include the Societies Act that Ruby just referenced. There may be sort of specific government relationships you have, whether you have a relationship with a municipal government for space, for example. You could have industry relations if you're working, depending on the purposes of your market. And those are things that you don't have influence over. There may be laws, there may be guidelines that you need to be paying attention to as a condition of your relationship with that organization, but they are not something that you have influence over. They are not going to mandate equity, any of these things. They're not going to get in the way of it either, but they're not there to mandate equity within your board the way they're written. When you get into the strategic and the operational spheres, though, those are places where you are writing the rules, you're writing the policies, and this is where you can really have some very specific input into how equity is viewed within your organization. So everybody will have a constitution and bylaws associated with their society. If you're a board member and you haven't seen your constitution and bylaws, find them. It's really important that you look at them and understand them. Those are fairly high level, and they don't have policy statements within them, but they certainly set the stage for what your market can and can't do. And then of course there are your own policies and procedures that are written up, and those are much more specific about how you operate as a board. And also then more procedurally, as you get into operational documentation, there's guidelines and procedures and standard operating procedures, that kind of thing, that also are like a series of documents that set the culture of your organization. And having one equity policy is not going to be what brings equity to the forefront in how you make decision making. It really is, as Ruby was saying, going back to those 4 agreements as a framework for looking at how you implement policies and procedures that is really going to bring equity into the culture of your organization. But these are sort of the realms in which that you can start to have those conversations. We talked a little bit about equity statements. Ruby, you were maybe going to talk about hierarchy and indigenous ways of knowing as part of this.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Paige. So one of the things I wanted to add here is about the language of equity, and so 2 things on that. One is indigenous ways of knowing. So one of the things that we've been trying to do with one of our organizations is and this wouldn't have happened, I believe it wouldn't have happened as fast as it's happened, or that we're trying to approach it, if it wasn't for COVID. And that's one thing I wanted to at some point later on look at, what has changed in your organizations in terms of practice and policy because of COVID, because I think it really brought attention to the inequities. But so going back to what Paige said, there's a lot of rules and regs and policies, and we can get lost in the bylaws and in motions and making friendly amendments to motions. We can get lost in when you can make a motion, when you can have discussion, all those sorts of things. And coming from a municipal background as well, I mean, it can get pretty crazy. And so one of the things that I really wanted us to have a hard look at is when the language of equity is really excluding people from a conversation and from excluding them from participating or even wanting to be on a board, right? Robert's rules of order is something that I know some of you probably are looking at to say, why is this the only way we organize our our business? Now, there's some parts that legally we have to, which is a whole other conversation. But one of the pieces that we've been looking at is Indigenous ways of knowing. So, maybe rethinking the hierarchy of your organization. Maybe that's not working. Maybe that individual who is the president, maybe that's a rotating piece, right? And maybe you can work on the bylaws for that. But really looking at, and when I say Indigenous ways of knowing, there's a whole conversation and what's the word, I guess, thought on how to interpret it. And in the learnings that I have kind of been privy to, it's about dismantling the hierarchy. And to me, a lot of times that is the colonialism piece that people just back away from. And that is the hard conversation that a lot of people have a hard time, I feel. And it's okay, because I think that it's important to approach it head on. But looking at the hierarchy of your organizations, and I think many of us have been to those meetings where we feel like we are just not able to share ideas, participate, because we don't have the right language. We didn't know if it was a motion or not a motion. Then all of a sudden, because we didn't have the right language, whatever it was, our great idea that we want to share, it gets passed over. So as an example, my daughter, she'll be 16 in April, and so she's starting to explore and being approached and engaged in her school, and she's been encouraged to be a treasurer on one of the groups in her school. And so she came home, and again, she's kind of lucky because she has myself and my husband who've both been in not-for-profit for many decades. And she says she's been asked to be a treasurer. And she says it's really scary. She's not sure what it even means. It just sounds, like really, really, what is it? And we said, well, basically you just count. Like you count money. You count how much you get and how much you spend. That's all you're doing. And so I just wanted to remind people, let's not look at the rules as a way to block people, but let's maybe look at it as a rule, as a way to rethink them and reapproach them. And again, many of you are here because you want to do that, but I think the language of equity is really something that we need to start to take a hard look at. And it takes time to have those conversations and explain, but I think there's we need to start with that at some point.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things we were talking about earlier this morning, Ruby, we were touching base, was the looking at how to personalize equity and understand what it is in an active way as opposed to a more passive sense. So I was sharing, for example, in my daughter's school, there's a teacher who started something called the Equity Backpack Project, which it's a very cool project. Neither of my kids is unfortunately involved in it, but it was a project that they were doing through their social studies class, where they actually were building backpacks with tools in them to help them be anti-racist. And it was kind of a little bit of a lightning bulb that went on for me hearing the teacher talk about this she was talking about it on the radio at one point. And then also the principal, the principal is a white guy in a school where the student population is largely Punjabi, and so he, was very clear that he has not faced a lot of the barriers that his students and a lot of his teaching staff face on a regular basis. And so how important it was for him to understand what it means to be anti-racist. So it's not a matter of passively saying, I'm not racist, or our board is open to people of many backgrounds and diversity. But how do we become anti-racist, or how do we become proactive as boards in promoting equity, not just sort of sitting back and saying, we're open to having whoever on our board, and we, are welcoming, and we looked for ways to include people. But how do we turn this into an active pursuit? And how can we reflect that in terms of this slide? How do we reflect that in our policies and procedures, but then also just in the community of our board? I think I'll move on to the next slide.
Sure. I think maybe though, Paige, I'd like to see if anybody has any examples of, sometimes we learn by what hasn't worked well, rather than what has worked well. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to share any examples in terms of stumbling blocks that have happened that you feel in your organizations has really caused a pain point for you, that you think, oh gosh, if we had handled that differently, maybe we could have got some great ideas out of that individual or participation that turned someone off. Anyone? No.
I'm trying to monitor the chat, but my screen turns off.
Oh, okay. I know it's really, that's, if I sound disjointed, it's because we're looking at 5 different screens and trying to engage everybody, right? It's kind of funny. But I do think that there are good examples of, if people are brave enough to share what hasn't worked well, and again, in terms of language at board meetings, that can scare people off.
Mm-hmm.
So Ruby, Paige, I wanted to throw in an example as you were talking about it, as I was starting to type this question about how I've been involved with organizations, boards, or committees that have put tremendous effort into rewriting the description so that it is more inclusive, and so that it's trying to take down some barriers, and then they say we're going to recruit in a way that will reach people, who means that we're going to have some more diversity and more voices, and then nothing happens. It's you still end up at the end of the day, the same group of people come on it. With the city committees I'm on, they've been on this path and journey for 2 or 3 years, but I return to the committee table and I'm still there, and so are people like me. How there people in redesigning things hasn't seemed to work at that level yet. Is there anything that can break that open so that it actually makes some significant changes into who's actually coming or feeling as if they even want to be involved? Because there's not even a chance to mess up at the board table, because there's nobody at the board table except people like you, me, rather.
Mm-hmm. So I'll share some thoughts since the questions come up. It was something I was going to share later on, but so one of the things that I think has really scared people is sometimes you approach people because they've been on a board before. Well, and a lot of boards say that, oh, we really want someone that has board experience or has been in the community. Well, you know what, they haven't really been involved so much. Maybe we should get them on a committee first, and let them prove themselves to us. Well, why? I mean, we're all learning as we go along, right? So why don't we invite people who haven't been on a board before? If they're there, if they are involved in your organization somehow, or they could be one of those frequent customers, right? They've obviously see value in what you're doing. I mean, obviously there's got to be some sort of connection, but you're probably recognizing your frequent market attendees. But yeah, they may not have been on a board before. Let's try that. Now, in terms of tangible, one of the things that that I feel we should start doing more, but it takes a lot of time. And that's the piece with this. It takes a lot of time, but it's so valuable in the end, is reaching out to your organizations in your community, your social organizations, the mothers groups, the grandmothers groups, the senior centers, the cultural organizations, the temples, the gurdwaras, right? I mean, let's go to them and say, this is what we're trying to do. I mean, I've honestly been to meetings where it's been challenging because I've heard people say, well, the Indo-Canadian group, they don't have a culture of volunteering, so why would we invite them? They're not going to know what we're doing, which is such a, again, I go back to my framework, like, what a horrible assumption. Of course we do. I mean, I've been in meetings where um, people are trying to engage the Indo-Canadian culture into recreational programming. And, someone said, well, I don't know if they actually participate in recreation. Well, they don't, just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So Peter, I don't know if this answers your question, but I think the first thing you have to do is assess where the gaps are. But I think you have to go to them. Like, maybe we meet in different areas, right? That are not always in the and now obviously we're all meeting on Zoom, so it's a different conversation. But maybe we're not meeting at an organization where the office, where it's not accessible to where people don't live, right? Maybe we meet at an area that's closer to where people, maybe we do a rotation and meet at the temples, or maybe we meet at some of the rec centers or social service organizations that have populations of programs that we want to tap into. um, it does take time, but I think that's one thing. The other piece that I know some organizations are starting to do is have shadow volunteer, like a shadow board members. So in opening up your meetings, so that you can invite people to board meetings, so they can actually witness and understand how it works. Which I know sometimes is scary because there's confidential. I mean, there's not a lot of confidential information, quite frankly, that happens in these meetings, right? There's some stuff, negotiations, but you can always do that in camera. um, I'll stop there for a minute though, but I really feel that there's a lot of organizations in your communities that you probably could reach out to. Um, and maybe you already are. And if you have and it hasn't gone well, we'd love to hear that as well.
Okay, I'll move sides. I think, Peter, we will come back to talk a little bit more about some of those practicality, like some of the practical solutions and suggestions as well as we move forward. Okay. Oops, I think I just went past it. There we go. All right. So looking at your board governance, one of the things that has been clear for me working with boards within the Farmers Market Society is that there's sort of a continuum of where boards are at. So at the beginning, you have the board that creates your organization, so your creation board. And then there tends to be sort of a flow that goes from there to like a board that's really involved in working for the organization, that maybe is the one that actually runs the market itself, and they're really like hands-on, getting in there, writing the press releases, doing all the things. And then moving on to one that's more into like management, like sort of starting to get into some of those policies and procedures and things. And then eventually moving through to being a board that focuses on governance and has probably a hired staff that is doing the management piece. So some of this will depend on the size of your market and the size of the community. But the overall idea is that no matter the size of your committee or your board or your community, you want to sort of be understanding what it is you're doing in any given situation. So if you are if you are on the board and you are volunteering at your market for the market manager, then you are like, you're sort of taking off your board hat and you're there as a working volunteer. And so being able to understand where the distinctions are about who is doing what at any given time helps to keep roles a little bit clear, and also helps to understand where the responsibilities are at any given moment, and get away from a situation where you are stepping on someone's toes or doing some micromanaging, for example, as a board. that's where a lot of dissatisfaction comes from market managers, for example, is when they feel that the board is like hovering over them all the time and not giving them the freedom to move or to take initiative or to have ideas. And so understanding when you are sort of in a governing role and when you're taking on a role that's more a management role is what this slide is trying to reflect. I guess part of the question is for you, and maybe this can be entered into the chat as the easiest way, is how would you describe the boards that you're on? Would you say that your boards are like on a working board that sort of runs the market, or are you focused on setting sort of strategic objectives and you are communicating that to a manager who's then taking on the management role? How would you guys describe the types of boards that you're involved with? And I guess part B to that question, I guess, is how has that changed for you over COVID? I think that's one of the things that Ruby and I were talking about earlier before this session started, was that COVID has had a huge impact on people's ability to participate, whether it's in the workforce or whether it's in volunteer positions like farmers markets boards. And how has COVID affected the makeup of your board and the ability of your board to work effectively as a team? And then did you want to say more about that, Ruby, with the particularly looking at COVID?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Paige. And are there any examples in there, Peter, that we want to share before, or should we give people time to write, maybe?
Yeah, so a couple of things have come in that Emily said that our board is working trying to head towards governing, and then Twyla wrote governance board, and Lindsay Forsbauer governance board, and Gwen from Abbotsford said our board was moving from managing to governing. And so those are kind of there's some working and governings in there, and then managing governing. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that I was going to share then is so what I've been experiencing in the time of COVID is two of the boards that I sit on. One of them for sure was governing, right? We had a solid governing kind of structure where we were quite hands off. And once COVID hit, we became significantly hands-on, right? In terms of writing press releases and in terms of being really active in fundraising and supporting staff, because we had to lay off staff. And this was a larger organization. And in another organization, we were kind of managing, but we have kind of moved a little bit more towards governing. Of course, somebody is now doing construction outside my house, so hopefully that's not too disruptive. So what I was going to share about this is that in this is where I feel a lot of organizations sometimes get lost, and this is where I think a lot of angst happens, right? Because you get in the weeds and then somebody's upset because you're weighing in on something that you shouldn't be, or there's the relationship between staff and board can become quite complex. It's usually in the governance of where you're supposed to be and where you're at. And this again is the framework that I think with our equity lens is really understanding that there's nuances in different communities in terms of what a board role is and what it isn't, right? And so this is where I think it's really important to do a check on what you want to be. But the most important thing is forgiving, because like I said, in COVID now, we've all kind of, I feel, and if you haven't shifted, well, that's amazing, right? To you, that you haven't shifted in some way on your board because of COVID, is to really look at, to give people permission to be able to be at different levels in your board. So you might have some people who are on a board who are at the beginning of a continuum of board development, and you might have some people that are more at a different end. But I do think it's important to have that conversation also with your staff and to understand that there are going to be instances where board members are going to want to be more in the weeds, and we're all learning together. So I don't know. I mean, I do feel like there's value though in hearing from some people if they're willing to share what they feel after with COVID, how their board has changed, and maybe in some instances they've learned that it might be more, you know, what they've learned from the COVID in terms of how their board has changed and what might they might keep after COVID. Like in terms of accessibility, has anybody found that because of Zoom meetings, more people are able to attend board meetings, or has it been, I know we found that. Is there anything in the chat, Peter? I can't see.
So nothing that got added to the chat, and I'm looking for any raised hands on the participants
Yeah,
list.
no.
But
I don't see any. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to share, and again, when you're looking at the continuum of it, it's okay if some, from in my opinion, it's okay if some board members don't understand what a governing board is right now. They will learn with you. So really being free when you are bringing on new board members to have that flexibility.
Okay.
Okay, next slide.
All right. So there's basically 5 kind of domains that that boards are responsible for in running an organization, and so these are in general the 5 things. So looking at mission, vision, and strategy, which is essentially strategic planning, defining roles and responsibilities for board and staff, director selection and onboarding, which is what Peter, you were asking about, and we'll touch on a little bit more here, decision-making processes, and then assessing performance. So these are sort of a cycle of things that the board will be doing on an ongoing basis as you move forward. So we'll get sort of right into it. What is a strategic plan? So the idea of a strategic plan is essentially, you know, like, it doesn't have to be complicated. A strategic plan is basically a way of structuring how you are going to be moving forward as an organization, setting out your priorities. So there are I think there's a lot of trepidation when it comes to looking at strategic planning for a board. There's a sense that it's a really massive process that requires a ton of funding and creates a really big document that nobody looks at. And those are, if that's experience that you have had, or if that's the case of your strategic plan at the moment for your farmers market, that's it's not a necessary place to be. Strategic plans can be very straightforward, and they can be something that you are working on continually. They don't have to be a document that's set in stone that never changes, and they can respond to changing needs of your organization. So let's see. I think I have. So one of the things that you work on as you work on a strategic plan is figuring out what is the mission of your organization, and it should be something that you as board members can like easily access, not that you have to be able to repeat it word for word necessarily, but that it makes sense to you, and that it's going to be a way to guide the types of decisions that you're making or the conversations that you're having in your meeting. So when I was on the board at the Langley Farmers Market, for example, we had our statement at the top of our agendas, and any other documents that we produced as an organization. We made sure that we could at least, you know, sort of review it on a regular basis so that it was top of mind when we were going through decision making. That's not to say that it was like, you know, the most original or the best mission statement, but it was just something that made sense for us in our organization. I also wanted to share with you quickly the strategic plan for the COABC, which is the Certified Organic Associations of BC. This was a process that was facilitated by an outside facilitator who is familiar with the food systems kind of community. And she helped that board work on, you know, obviously defining vision and mission and sort of the guiding principles that define the board, but then help them to create a strategic plan, which basically fits on one page. And so this isn't obviously not the nuts and bolts of how they're going to work on any one of the given objectives, but it is an easy reference document to come back to that says, this is how we're going to approach our organization over the next 5 years. And as they are going through making decisions or having conversations or looking at how to exert some influence with ministry staff, for example, these are the core areas that they're going to look at, making sure that they're moving forward. So that's the purpose of showing you this is sort of to move away from the idea that a strategic plan has to be like a big cumbersome document that is that takes hours to read through, and really understand that the more concise you can be in articulating the goals of your organization, probably the better off you are, in the sense that you can refer to them more easily and really bring it alive and bring it forward as actually living guiding principles for you in running your organization. So this is like, again, in this is as you're working on your strategic plan, like this strategic plan, obviously, like you don't necessarily see the word equity in a strategic plan like this, but that doesn't mean that equity isn't a part of it. So really what we're trying to get across is that, like, equity needs to be more than a word that you insert in a document, and it needs to be more than like what the faces look like around the table at your board table. So it's really about setting in place like languages and processes that are not going to be exclusive. Really, hammering down on Robert's rules and making sure that you're being really stiff about how you use them. Like, how can you as an organization look at your documents, your strategic plan, and all your operating documents as ways of opening up for different and varied experiences. I think that's all I really wanted to say about that slide. Did you want to add anything more to this slide?
Well, thanks, Paige. I mean, this Paige and I, as she's mentioned, we've met this morning just to kind of go over this, and I love this plan on a page. The organizational side of me just loves this, but I also kind of we talked about the chicken and the egg, right? Do you have the strategic plan and then go out and recruit board members, or do you have because a strategic plan really is only as good as the people who contributed to it, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe we look at your strategic plans if you have them, or if you don't have them and you're on the, you're interested in starting to develop one, really look at who is at the table and developing them. And yes, it's a guiding document, but I would also look at it as not a, I can imagine somebody, and I've been aware, witness this, where people say, well, we're not going to talk about equity because that's in our strategic plan for 2 years from now. Well, no, this is something that it's a guiding document, but it's not the end all and be all. So I think it is important to look at when you're recruiting board members is to really make sure that there's an opportunity for them to, even if they're new, to contribute to the equity or to the strategic plan somehow, and to tweak it and use it as a working document, because they're going to come to it as with a different lens and a different approach. But it is, as you can imagine, hard to come up with a final strategic plan, because COVID wasn't anybody's plan at all. But I do think that it's important to look at it, and maybe even with your members, like, because a lot of times they're going to have ideas as well. So maybe not to be so guarded about your strategic plan, because sometimes it can feel like it's this big secret and we can't change it. But I think the fluidity of what you do is really important here. And that's not normal, right? That's not how organizations have been in the 25 years of experience that I've kind of been involved. It's been, well, we have to present to this plan, then we have to present to the key performance indicators. Where are we at with this plan? But that doesn't allow for addressing inequities in a plan. Like, you need to be able to have that freedom sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So defining roles and responsibilities. I think that Ruby, maybe I'll get you to start off on this one. This is where we were really focusing in on language and how that can act as a barrier.
Sure. Thank you. So this, again, I'm coming from this as a lived experience, and this is where I feel like I want to share a little bit about what not to do. but I also feel, like I said, it's really hard in this kind of format, because you're already here, you're already involved, you're already wanting to make change and, and be inclusive. So I'm giving you that as well. We do have, like I heard from someone whose name I can't remember there, that there are some challenges, and I would like to address that afterwards, before we end at some point, in terms of the gender issue that's happening at one of those meetings. But so what happened, and this goes back to the framework of assumption. So one of the board members that I was at, or one of the boards that I was invited to, I was invited to be on a board. I was, this is many years ago, when I was much younger, and so not as brave. So I got to the board, and they said, "Oh, great, we're glad you're here. We really want you to start the diversity committee and chair the diversity committee." And I was like, "Wow, okay." Sitting around the table with a whole bunch of white people and wanting, this is why they brought me on. So I had a conversation with the board, and said, I'm not opposed to this, but I do have other skills, right? And I made it really clear. So I think one thing that we need to look at is, and it's challenging, I know it's not easy, is when you bring on somebody, let's look at them as a whole being, not just define them um, by that population or that community that we think we want them to be representing. We really need to let people come to the role and make it their own. Peter, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it was up because there was a comment that came in on this topic from Livia, and I was just going to have her read it, but I'm looking on the list and it looks like she might have had to step away. I know this is prime kids arriving back from school time.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
we might have missed her. So I'll lower my hand, and if she comes back on, I'll let her talk about her perspective, which is in the chat.
Oh, okay. Okay. And hopefully she comes back. If not, now I'm curious, but okay, we can wait. So one of the things that I was going to share is like I said before, is defining roles and responsibilities, is really making sure that our expectations are really, not about us, but about the organization. And so sometimes what happens is you recruit a board member that you think you're going to enjoy having on the board, that you think is going to work well with you and it's going to fit with you. But really doing a check-in, is that person really there because it makes it comfortable for you? Or is that person there because it's advantageous to the organization? And I know there's many boards, many times we've all seen it, where like, "Oh, my friend wants to be on the board," or "My friend wants to, needs some resume building, and they want to be on the board." And, it'll be great because we can carpool to meetings together and all that sorts of stuff. I'm hoping that doesn't happen anymore, but you know what? It does. It really, really does. I've seen it. I hear it. So really doing a check-in on who we're approaching and why we are approaching them, for the convenience. And then when they're there, if they have and this is the key, I think, is if they have a difference of opinion, is to have that respectful environment where we have that conversation. And one of the things that I've heard, and it's too bad because it kind of came later on, is I think there's value sometimes in checking in with people who have left your board, right? And who've left the board either before their term ended or even after their term, and ask them why they left, right? What observations do they have to make your board better? Was it inclusive? Did you feel it was supportive? Were you able to share your voice? Because they have no skin in the game anymore, really. And so they can really have that conversation. You can even do a survey with them, so that you can find out what's happening. It can be an anonymous survey, but I think that that's a really great resource for you to find out what's working and what's not working. And then there's no pointing fingers, right? And to be able to blame. So that's one thing I wanted to share. And then again, just and when you're defining roles and responsibilities of a board, I think we really have to start to pay attention to where are the gaps, right? So look at what your board is at, and um, where are the gaps? And I don't know how many people actually do that. And when I mean gaps, in terms of like a gap assessment in terms of skills, rather than automatically, yes, we want to define and figure out how to deal with inequities, but it needs to be a skills-based recruitment, not necessarily like what I had. Oh, we'll go ask the Indo-Canadian person who's been working in fundraising for, and she'll be on board. The other thing I was going to say is defining roles and responsibilities in terms of just accessibility is time of day. This is something we had a challenge with the city committees that I was on, and I don't think it's been fixed yet. Is time of day your meetings are on? That's a big deal, right? If you meet in the evenings, a lot of women are not able to do that, right? Because that's still the primary time that a lot of women are taking care of their kids. It's still the primary situation in their families. So really looking at all those nuances. But again, I would highly encourage you to reach out to some of your past board members and find out what's worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. I think so a little bit, well, I'll get into that as we talk about recruitment. So I'll move on from here. The next slide is really sort of more of a technical kind of idea of looking at boards and helping to understand some of the policy work that boards do versus the day-to-day work that management does. And a lot of times, so I mean, obviously you're looking for diversity on your board, but also one of the major power issues that are at markets are between board and management, and which could be, which could be quite heightened if you're looking also at looking at like an all-white board working with a person of color as your manager or something. Like there's power dynamics that you need to be aware of in whatever case, and especially if the power dynamics are exacerbated. And so knowing kind of what your role is as a board is a helpful way to understand when you are when you're working within the realm of policy and setting sort of broad goals, and when you're actually getting into directing some of the management pieces of your board that actually belong to your market manager. But I won't say too much more about that. We can certainly come back to that with questions.
And Paige, I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if we want to do, because we have 15 minutes, if we want to do a few questions or if you wanted to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I don't think I don't have the participant list up, but I don't think Livia is Livia back, or do you want to? Should we speak to that, Peter?
Yeah, I just I reached out to her on Slack, and she did have to go pick up her daughter.
Mm.
But I don't know if you see it there, but if you want, I can just read it out.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So Livia wrote. And Livia she currently works with us as a regional coordinator on the coupon program and was a former manager of the Cranbrook Farmers Market and is a newcomer to Canada from about 5 years ago. I feel that all boards in general need to become more flexible and attractive to people from different backgrounds and ages. It still feels very bureaucratic and stiff, mostly following a quote unquote white European model. One really good step would be to include governance topic in the secondary school curriculum, showing the importance of politics and governance in our lives and why people should engage. Also, it would be interesting to see a marketing campaign in a provincial, maybe even federal level, educating and encouraging people to get engaged with local nonprofit organizations.
Yeah. So I'm going to just speak to that really quickly if I can here. So one of the things that we recognized when I was working with the city and the city committees is childcare, right? That was a fundamental issue on the barrier for a lot of people to participate. Obviously, largely women, but sometimes men as well. And so one of the things that I had decided to do is pitch. We started these kind of town halls, a brown bag with the mayor. And so people could pop in and they didn't have to pre-register. Well, you would think that City Hall was on fire, right? Because people were like, wow, they're just going to show up and ask the mayor questions. And I said, yes, you don't think that they do that at the Safeway when he's getting his groceries? I'm sure he's going to figure it out, and we'll facilitate that. So I think there's a lot of and so on that, what I also said is that there's going to be an area where we'll have some toys and people are able to bring kids in council chambers. We're going to hold it in council chambers. There's like, wow, we're going to let people in council chambers. And I said, well, people actually pay for council chambers through their taxes. So yes, we're going to let people in council chamber. So we started to do this where we had toys and people could come to these little impromptu town hall meetings with the mayor. And it was really interesting to see the dynamics, because some of the staff who'd been there for many, many, many years were like, well, this is just not professional. Whereas the work still got done. And in fact, it was even better because the people who wanted to participate didn't have to watch their clock all the time or worry about their cell phone all the time, wondering if their children were okay. They were in the room there. And so I totally, this is where I think this conversation is a little bit challenging, because one of the things that I feel is we do really need to start to look at these rules. Why do people have to pre-register? Why are our board meetings closed? Like, we've got Zoom now. Why don't we just say, hey, the board meeting for your local farmers market's going to happen. Why don't you join? And send it out to the vendors as well. If there's anything that's confidential in terms of negotiating, or something that, if you're having a personnel issue, I can see that being closed. But we have this opportunity now with Zoom to make it free and to make it open and transparent.
I think maybe to the point that Peter was making earlier too, is that it's a matter of taking it, like, you don't necessarily have the whole plan in front of you in terms of how you're going to remove barriers, or even identifying what all the barriers are. But making a start sends the right signal and points you in the direction of the next one. And I think that's been true of my experience with the boards on farmers markets, where you kind of start from a place where it's like, who are we going to get? No one's going to want to do this. It's like, where are we going to find the volunteers? We don't have enough people. We don't have enough capacity. And if that's the starting point, if you're really starting from a point of scarcity, that's what you're going to find. Whereas if you start from a point of like, well, let's figure out what are some barriers for people to be attending our meetings or what have you, and put it out there that this is what we're trying to do, that it's amazing how the next step will be revealed.
Sorry, I really want to, who had that? It's just bugging me that someone had that question around, or challenge around somebody on their committee that's having to deal with some gender discrimination, I guess, issues. What was the question? Just so we can make sure we don't forget.
That was Johanna, and she's still here if she wants to come on. And Johanna also commented on Robert's rules being used as a weapon rather than a tool. So maybe she can talk about that. Like, sometimes people use it to shut down other conversations.
100%.
Yeah. So Johanna, are you able to come on mic?
She?
I don't.
Maybe not. No.
Yeah, she's talking in the chat. She's talked in the chat, but she's not coming on mic. So.
Okay.
Hi. I'm not sure that I feel comfortable talking about that right now, but I'd really like to have a conversation about it if you could have it at a different time.
Sure.
So it's a little awkward. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And maybe you can get in touch with Peter, and I'm fine if you want my email or phone number, or I'm sure Paige is the same. But I do feel like the Roberts rules, it would be interesting to do a workshop just on that. What can we change? Where can we change it? Why are we stuck on this? And how it is actually making our organizations more dysfunctional than functional. I think that is really the conversation that we should start having. And I know there's a whole bunch of legislation on why we use it, but I think that is something, and and not-for-profits really have the bandwidth to start to change policy. So if we start to have this conversation, I think that would be gold.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about this earlier today too, where we were, I think what was always important for me when I was on the board at the farmers market was to realize like what we run is like this incredible like event, a community event every week that like pops up and disappears and brings in amazing food and brings in artisans, and like there's music, and obviously not in the year of COVID, but like there's all sorts of vibrancy and community associated with what we do, and it's a beautiful thing. And so we can take ourselves so seriously when we're sitting around a board table, and part of what we can do is getting away from really focusing on Robert's rules. Like, of course, there's like times when we need to get things in the right order. But for the most part, we don't have to run our meetings with a gavel. So things that we used to do, for example, or I still do in organizations I'm involved in, is have a check-in at the beginning of a meeting, which is really an opportunity to say, here I am at this meeting, and you can share something or not share something, but it's an opportunity to sort of let people around the table with you understand how you're able to participate or not participate. So maybe you've just been rear-ended and you're frazzled and you just need a few minutes before you're really going to be able to fully engage, or maybe whatever, like maybe you've had a really stressful day at work, and you've turned around and this is like a happy place for you to be, and so you're grateful to the people there for being able to run a market together. Like those, just being able to check in at the beginning of your meeting, going back to those 4 agreements, really allows you to understand that whatever's happening for somebody is happening for them, and it's not about you. And so it helps to create that community feeling within the board, and also be a place of support for each other, as opposed to a place where we have to like be hammering down rules down each other's throats. So that was one big piece. And the same thing at the end of the meeting was a checkout, a way to review, did this meeting, did it go okay? Or the other thing that we often have, like somebody checking time, and I'm sure Peter, you're on top of us. I know we're getting close to end here, but the other piece of it was to have like an emotional reader of the meeting. So somebody who could who was maybe intuitive and who was good at listening, and who could kind of look at the room and say like, yeah, there's an elephant in here that we need to identify, and who could bring it up in a meeting, or could follow up with somebody afterwards and say, hey, I saw that interaction and it left me feeling uncomfortable. How are you feeling? And as a way to really build community within your organization. I think that one of the things that was really important for me when we started talking about board experience, and maybe we're sort of moving ahead a little bit here, which is fine, is looking at boards are, if you're on a board now, or you're going to be on a board, you're somebody who's going to be engaged in your community, and in all likelihood, once you move off a farmers market board, you're going to move into a board in another aspect of your life in your community. And you should really be using your board experience, and if you are in a sort of more leadership role within your board, then you should be looking for ways for your board members to be really gaining experience that is going to be making them a better board member for future boards. Maybe it's not your board, but it's like for future boards. And ideally this is happening all over the place, so that people who you're receiving have had people nurture them along their board path as well. This is it's an important piece of community service that we do when we sit on boards. And it's important that it is also contributes to our own self-development. So you should not assume that all your board members know how to read a financial statement. And why not spend a meeting learning how to do that, so that the language is not exclusive, but it's a way of saying, let's learn about this together. There are all sorts of pieces of being on the board that can be owned by one person, whether they're the treasurer, the secretary, or the chair, or whatever, that don't need to be owned, that your board functions better if they're shared piece of knowledge. And so making sure that those small bits of training that are impactful in terms of people's ability to participate in your meeting are brought up regularly, and are a focus of how you sort of curate someone's board experience as they're moving through their term with you.
Yeah, and sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm going to switch slides. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say that none of this is easy. I mean, it hasn't been easy for. And what I mean not easy, I think one of the main challenges with boards is the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And with hierarchy, there's power, and that power I've seen it in small boards, I've seen it in large boards. It's a really, really, really hard to call people on it. So those of you that are on this, this presentation and are on boards, I think there is value in really doing a gut check when you're at meetings. And if something doesn't seem right to you or doesn't seem transparent to you, is to have that conversation out loud. And what's the worst that can happen? Nobody agrees with you, but at least whoever you've addressed that concern to is now going to have to do a double check in terms of, oh, why am I not sharing, or why am I not being transparent? But I think, and why I bring that up is because that's what I think really prevents some people from wanting to reach out to other people, is the power. So if you go and start to look at all these other, bring in youth, bring in different racialized or discriminated communities, you might get asked the hard questions, right? And I think, like I said, the main thing is it's hard for individuals to stand up, but look at what the worst case consequences if you do. I mean, I'm starting to do that on my own boards and my own groups and even in my workplace, and it seems scary at first, but now it's like I'm seeing people asking, oh yeah, why don't we look at things from an environmental lens? Or why do we put all the, racialized people on these diversity groups? But if you call it out in a respectful way, I think it can make a difference.
Yeah. Okay, so I see, I was just looking in the chat and talking about how, yeah, like what we're saying is like working from a top-down perspective, where it's really about one person holding power and dictating the agenda is really not going to be a very successful way of running your board if you're interested in harnessing a diversity of views and opinions to really move your board forward. Okay, so I think like we are, I think we're running close to time. Hey, Peter. So maybe we can wrap things up a little bit. Let me just move on. I'm just trying to think if there's any. I guess part of the last piece of it really is around assessing performance and really looking at, this goes back to your strategic plan and looking at the types of statements that you espouse within your organization around how you want to be inclusive and looking at diversity within your organization. And really looking at on a regular basis, how are you holding up against that, and what are the this goes back to looking at like, well, we've opened up our meetings to be on Zoom or at a more convenient time of day, and that's brought some folks in, and what's the next step? Like, this is a way for you to be constantly looking at how you can be continually improving. Assessing performance obviously goes in all sorts of directions. That has to do with like board assessing performance of a manager against sort of specific outcomes, but also looking at, as a board, one of the most important pieces I think is like a self-evaluation tool. So if you were recruited to the board for a specific purpose or for skills, or when you were recruited to the board, it was clear that these are priorities for how the board is going to function, then to be able to regularly look at those and say, how have I measured up against these kinds of expectations, is a really helpful way to do some self-reflection that will improve your board experience for the following year. And it opens the way for conversations around to have with other members of the board or with the chair about, this is the experience I've had in this past year, and I'd really like to be able to focus more on a type of training or on these kinds of conversations or what have you. But without taking the time as a board to do some of that self-evaluation and self-reflection, you'll end up doing the same thing over and over again. And if it's not what you want to be doing, then that becomes a problem. So do you want to say anything more about the assessment piece, Ruby?
Only that, if you go to Stats Canada, each community will have kind of a profile of your community, right? What is the the demographics of your community in terms of age, gender, in terms of different racialized groups, language. I'm not sure yet if it has anything about there's some data that's not being collected. But anyway, where I'm going with this is I would really look at that data and see if that's reflected on your board. Because if it's not, that's, you know, that's number one, is to see if it's reflected on your board. And if it's not, then you know, that's where you can actually use some stats to address it at your board level. Because sometimes, you know, individuals aren't open to that conversation. But if you can say, listen, this is what Stats Canada says our community is, but that's not represented here at that board. So that can be a starting point, I think, for some of these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's always a work in progress. I mean, we don't have all the answers, but I think the conversations are the most important piece.
Yeah. So I'm involved in Girl Guides, have been for a really long time. And so we're coming up on February 22nd is the birthday of Lord and Lady Baden Powell, for anybody who's not been involved in guiding. And it's an opportunity to really look back at community and what community means to us. And I think that this is a message that's really resonated for me in a lot of areas of my life. And I think for boards as well, the idea that you leave it better than you found it. So if this topic is engaging to you and you want to be able to bring this back to your board, that is certainly a way then you can be leaving your board better than you found it. But looking also at your own experience on the board and finding a way to make sure that that when you are bringing, you know, as you leave the board and more people are coming on, that the experience that they're going to have on the board is enriched because you were able to contribute to the conversation and really take some of your own personal leadership in bringing topics that are important to you forward to the board. And so that's the encouragement piece that I would like to leave you with at the end of our presentation tonight. Ruby, do you have any closing thoughts?
Closing. Well, thank you for listening and thank you for attending. I think that's really inspiring for me. And like I said before, there's no, like, it's a lot of work. It's hard work. And I think that if you're a champion in your